Well, this week, Premier Danielle Smith has officially launched the Alberta Next panel, which will hit the road in Alberta this summer and into the early fall. The idea is to gather input, provide feedback for the Alberta government on how Alberta can best protect its interest and strengthen its place within Confederation. One of the 15 members of that panel is joining us here today to talk more about all of this. Very pleased to welcome to the program Michael Binnion, who is president of Questerre Energy and also executive director of the Modern Miracle Network. Mr. Binnion, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the
Yep.
program.
Well, I appreciate the invite. Thanks, Rob.
Talk about how this came about. I mean, were you eager to be a part of this? How much did the premier have to convince you?
I'm actually quite worried about the conversation around Alberta sovereignty and autonomy,
Mhm.
and just even discussing the potential to reconfederate. Even that it's that there's some voices out there, I think, that are starting to maybe move away a little bit from the rule of law, and I feel it's important for it's very important conversation like Alberta's position in Canada. The country continues to evolve, and so do different provinces' position in it. And but I do think that conversation has to be held very responsibly, seriously, and very much within the frame of rule of law. So, yeah, I was predisposed to be interested.
Yeah. Do you think this is needed right now? What do you hope that this might be able to accomplish?
I do think that we have people who are disaffected for different reasons and different groups, and that the conversation is going to happen on some basis anyways. And so I do think that being able to put a responsible frame around that conversation is important, given that it's not it is these are not this is not a fringe group. I mean,
Right.
even the people putting out polling talking about that there's really no interest in greater sovereignty for Alberta might be a majority. The fact is, it's not a fringe minority either. This is a substantial, as I said, even on the more conservative polls, it's a substantial minority of Albertans who are concerned about these issues. The conversation is going to happen anyways, and let's put it in a responsible frame.
Right. And it's something you've been talking about. You wrote a piece for the Calgary Herald, I think it was last month, talking about, the idea of more responsible self-government, but Alberta, and I mean, for that matter, other provinces, really asserting what already exists as rights, provincial rights under the Constitution.
Yeah, what at the paper I've written, and I'm in the process of getting it published, but I wrote an op-ed sort of summarizing the point. But the point that I'm making, and to try to make it as simple as possible, because it's the constitutional history of Canada, which is actually quite complicated and went over. A lot of people think Canada came into being on 1867. They taught me that in Canadian history in grade 10. That's what I used to believe. In fact, this was a very long process from 1763. When New France became an English colony, to the 1759, like the creation of legislatures, and then the late 1830s rebellions, and all the way to 1982 when we finally patriated the Constitution. The most recent significant constitutional change for Canada was in 1998 and 2000 with the Clarity Act, confirming that there is that it's legitimate for provinces to secede. The underlying principle, unwritten constitutional principle that animates all of that evolution is something called responsible government. And what it really is saying, and it was first articulated in the Durham reports, is that if you can demonstrate the ability to self-govern in a responsible way, then there's good reason to devolve power towards the people who are being governed. And this is how Ottawa or Canada became autonomous from Great Britain and London, was through this long evolutionary process of demonstrating responsible self-government. And there is absolutely no reason why any other province couldn't do the same thing. There's no reason why First Nations can't do the same thing. That if you can demonstrate responsible self-government, why should there not be, under this 200-year plus constitutional convention, why shouldn't there be an ability to devolve more powers
Mhm.
closer to the people being governed?
What do you think we need from Ottawa? I mean, there's got to be some value to being a part of Confederation. We do need a federal government to make decisions in the best interest of the country, as we saw in the fight between Alberta and BC over Trans Mountain. The federal government said to BC, "Look, I mean, this is federal jurisdiction, and so there's a limit, maybe to the extent to which provinces can tell Ottawa to take a hike." Right?
Sure, but what I would say is that we to remember we started as four separate colonies that
Mhm.
came together in the BNA Act, and each of those colonies then said, in relative to our creating more autonomy from Great Britain, we would be willing to give certain powers to a central body and certain powers that should stay with us as colonies. And that principle, confederation, is still embedded in our Constitution today as the principle of responsible government as well. And so, of course, there are certain things we've said that the federal government has sovereignty over, and there are certain things that the provinces have sovereignty over. I would say that generally, your point, if it's an area of federal jurisdiction, defense, interprovincial trade, these sorts of things, then why wouldn't we say that we need a strong national government to make decisions in those areas? If they're in areas of provincial sovereignty, then I think it's reasonable to question, to what extent should the federal government be interfering in areas that is not actually part of their sovereignty?
Right. And we've seen that happen. We've seen a federal government that uh, has intruded into provincial jurisdiction, or a willingness to intrude into federal jurisdiction to try to coerce provinces into giving up some of that jurisdiction, dangling money. So we've seen it in different ways, haven't we?
Sure. I think we've seen two things. One thing that I would say that, on paper, Canadian provinces probably have more sovereignty than US states. But here's a fundamental difference. In the United States, the Supreme Court appointees are affirmed by the Senate, and the Senate is a regional interest body. So difficult to get a Supreme Court justice appointed in the United States that doesn't respect state rights because of
Right.
they have to be affirmed by that. In Canada, of course, it's appointed by the federal government, and the affirmation of that appointment is not by the provinces or by any regional body. So perhaps unsurprisingly, our Supreme Court has gravitated towards justices that might more often defend federal rights than provincial rights. And as confederation has evolved, we've started to move more to almost a federation model than a confederation model. And in part, I think it's because we've had a series uh, of court cases that have tended to side a little bit more with federal powers, notwithstanding notwithstanding question. And I think the most glaring example of that was this peace, order, and good government decision on carbon taxes, where the Supreme Court
Right.
was willing to say, well, that's not a tax at all. We've decided it's a regulatory charge. And we've decided that, notwithstanding it's clearly within provincial jurisdiction, that we're going to override that with the peace, order, and good government clause because of the necessity for collective action. So this was I think one of the more glaring examples of a very federal leaning court overriding provincial jurisdiction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think these jurisdictional issues, I mean, it's not just about energy issues. And I know that dominates a lot of the conversation because it's such a hugely important sector of our economy. And we've seen a lot of federal policies that have really been targeted at the energy sector. When we talk about these boundaries and these jurisdictions, like these are principles that go well beyond just one industry, right?
I think it really comes down really to this issue of responsible government. Like what's the best level of government to manage these things? And I think we have, like, I would say that I've spent a lot of time in Quebec. I've got a big gas discovery there, and I've had the pleasure of spending 25 or 30 years there talking to Quebecers about resource development.
Mhm.
What I would say is that the debates about whether Quebec was a distinct society that we had in Canada in the 1980s, I mean, this is merely a statement of fact. Having been there long enough, I mean, Quebec is undoubtedly a distinct culture and a distinct society. What I would say, though, is I don't think Quebec has a monopoly on that.
Right.
I believe that the Atlantic Canada and the Maritimes have distinctive natures to their culture. I believe Central Canada and Ontario do as well. The Prairie provinces, or the West, as I would refer to it, the West, the Prairie provinces, this is where I grew up. I mean, we absolutely have a distinct culture, and we could argue the same thing for BC. I think this issue of a flexible and asymmetrical federation, which we've had since the beginning, is is helpful to recognize these cultural differences in terms of the way we want to live and the way we want to be governed. Within a within one country that shares a lot of values.
Right, and it's not a bad thing that different provinces go in different directions in certain areas. That it gets back to that point as you talk about of self government. I think that's what Albertans seem to be saying here, that we want a little more say in our own destiny.
The assertion that I made in the op-ed and I make in the paper is that, discussions about, actual separation or independence. Let's look at the evolution. Ottawa and Canada didn't become independent overnight. It was a period of time for them for our nation. As I said, starting in 1763, it wasn't even until 1931 that our parliament became supreme over law in Canada with the Statute of Westminster. So Canada had to demonstrate the ability to responsibly self-govern ourselves as a nation in the world, which we did, and we of course are an independent sovereign nation as a result. I don't think that any province should be trying to assert full independence until you can demonstrate self-government. And by the way, whether you want autonomy or don't want autonomy, who doesn't want responsible self-government?
Right. I do want to talk about the energy sector. And I mean, we are at an interesting moment here where I think there's a possibility that we could see a shift in direction. I think there's a real opportunity that's presenting not just Alberta, but presenting to Canada right now to really seize an opportunity. How bullish or optimistic are you that we're going to embrace that opportunity?
There's certainly been a big change in our cultural perception. The It's interesting. I would say Alberta saw the difference in the special relationship with the United States
Yeah.
over 10 years ago. The canceling of XL pipeline by Obama made it very clear. In fact, I did a speech at the National Coalition of Chiefs in 2016 or 2017 saying the special relationship with the United States is not what it used to be. I don't think there was any shock in Western Canada or Alberta when we saw Trump talking to Canada in a way that we didn't used to see in the 1940s, 50s, 60s,
Yeah.
or even in the 80s. I think it was a shock to central Canada. I think a lot of people in central Canada thought the canceling of that pipeline was something to do with climate or environmental issues, and when in fact it was a change in how much United States actually needed our oil because they had this unbelievable boom, and become the world's largest producer of oil in a very short period of time, which makes Canada's promise to deliver secure oil less valuable. And we first saw this in the 2015 with the pipeline. We've since seen it with Trump and his tariff positions. What it has highlighted is the importance of Canadian energy in the world is it fluctuates, and of course on the other side of that, we see events in the world like Ukraine and Iran, and we live in a very volatile world relative to energy. So it does, I think, bring up for Canadians that we do need to think hard about what is our place in the world and what do we want our place in the world. And I would say for sure the to be a responsible, reliable supplier, not just of oil and gas, but of resources generally, is a role that allows Canada to be a senior player in the world. I'm not really sure there is another role besides our being that secure supply of resources, and whether that's wheat or oil, it's critical to the world, and a place we can be a senior player.
Yeah, and it's about getting it to the world. I mean, we saw some numbers this week. Alberta's going to see another record year when it comes to production, and what point do we run into that capacity crunch again? And challenging our ability to move this product and be able to export it abroad, as we're now finally starting to do through the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Yeah, and I've seen this, and of course, we all love to report records in the media and to hear about them. But let's put this into context. I mean, America, America is like something at 14 million barrels a day, and I'm not sure where they
Right.
came. I can't remember where they came from, but it was like maybe 6 million barrels. They've more than doubled their production, and Canada's busy celebrating that we're up 10% or something like that. I mean, and don't quote me on those numbers, but relatively speaking, that's what it's about. So let's not pat ourselves on the back too hard. Why didn't Canada also double our production during that time?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's that whole question of lost opportunity that I think is a big part of the conversation right now, which kind of gets us back to where we are, and not just embracing an opportunity but trying to make up for lost time, that there's got to be a maybe more of a sense of urgency here.
Well, one would hope so, but a lot of it comes down to, I think, who do Canadians think we are? Not just in our regional cultural areas where we want to, self-govern on the things that make sense, but on the areas where we have in common and want to work together in the world. And I think we do need a Canadian consensus that being a responsible, reliable supplier to our allies of the resources that are needed, with, as I said, critical minerals or forest products or any of these things that the world really needs. Do we want to be that reliable partner that consistently punches above our weight that the world can count on? And as you can hear from this, obviously I'm advocating for that. But we have not had a Canadian consensus on that for some time, and I believe the country's languished while we've been discussing it.
Yeah, I think, depending on how we measure a consensus, like I think based on what we're seeing from opinion polls, even you could argue the last election, I think Canadians, there's a consensus there. It's just a question, I guess, of whether the people in charge of making the decisions, whether it exists there. But I think the good news for Albertans is when we look at how Canadians are feeling across the country, there does seem to be a lot of consensus.
I think it's rapidly emerged when there was an external threat that was not
Yeah.
just recognized in Alberta because our pipeline was canceled to Louisiana, but recognized nationally because Trump was talking about putting tariffs on his good friends Canada. So having a national recognition that there could be an external threat also helps you to think about, well, there are also external friends, and why aren't we helping them? So, and I will just point out, as you said, I'm a founder and executive director of Modern Miracle Network, which is really an organization that was provocatively saying, just a second, modern society is a true miracle, and why do we have the benefit of modern society today? And it's because of affordable energy. And so in 2015, just to remind you and people listening, Canada, it was, everybody said Canada had the dirtiest oil in the world. And we started MMN to say, just a second, there's two sides to this story, and we can't be comparing the benefits of one kind of energy to the costs and impact of another kind. All energy has benefits, all energy has costs and impacts, and let's have an adult conversation about that. And one of those points was, well, there are undoubtedly impacts to developing things like the oil sands. It is also delivering miraculous benefits to people here in Canada and around the world. And let's not throw that baby out with the bathwater. And I do think that today, 10 years later, it's a completely different conversation in Canada, a much more adult, balanced conversation in Canada about energy and our importance in the world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as mentioned, the Alberta Next panel gets to work pretty soon here. I guess you'll be heading onto the road fairly shortly here. Alberta.ca/next. People want to find out more about where the meetings are taking place. I guess you're eager to get out and be a part of this.
Well, I've never done anything like. Well, I shouldn't say this. I have done a lot of public hearings in Quebec about shale
Mhm.
gas, and so that might be an analogous experience. I did learn from that experience that if people don't feel listened to, genuinely heard, then it's a lot more difficult to develop consensus on anything. So I am looking forward to it. As I said, it's certainly a new experience for me here in my home province of Alberta. So I'm actually excited to hear from people all across the province and find out what are animating people.
Should be very interesting. Michael Binnion, thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Really appreciate this.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the conversation.